Hello everyone and welcome back to another video where today we are looking at another Doctor Who Reddit leak, or I guess technically a Discord leak. This is from the same user who talked a bit about the war for the showrunner job between Pete McTighe and Jack Thorne, and obviously the BBC and Bad Wolf and their respective preferences. They've come out with a bit of a giga leak that we're going to be looking at today. Obviously, as always, take these with a grain of salt. Obviously, they're not necessarily true, but they sometimes do have kernels or nuggets of truth in them. So we're just going to take a look, have a bit of fun. Subscribe if you're new, that'd be greatly appreciated. We're trying to get to 40,000 subscribers, and any support would be greatly appreciated. We do regular Doctor Who content here on the channel. But with that said, let's get right into it. So I'm taking this from r/Doctor Who News, potential new leaks from a reputable member of the Doctor Who leak server. I don't know where this Doctor Who leak server is, but I want in. I don't know, obviously, I'm assuming it's on Discord, but like, send me a link if anyone has one, because I want to see this stuff for myself. But anyway, Dinosaur 21. The Disney deal was more or less over following Season 1's performance. Disney's stance going into Season 2 was basically, let's just wait and see, which is why they refused to greenlight Season 3, which was RTD's original hope. This created a pretty big domino effect. Everyone on the production team, despite trying to stay hopeful, more or less knew Disney wouldn't be giving them a Season 3. Any Season 3 of the show they did get would therefore be a long way off, and almost certainly a BBC-only production. And even if it somehow got a Disney renewal, production would still be quite far away. Because of this, Ncuti decided to step down. He was always happy to do 3 seasons, but that was the intention of filming them over the course of 3 years, especially after just committing to 5 years of sex education, which RTD had basically promised due to overestimating how well Season 1 would perform. So towards the end of Season 2 production, Ncuti made the decision to leave, and a new ending to Season 2 was filmed in early 2025. Originally, the ending was a fade to black, but RTD felt airing a stronger cliffhanger might just improve the show's chances of renewal, which resulted in him bringing Billie Piper in at the very last minute. So that's basically the context to everything we know. All of that pretty much lines up with stuff that we've more or less been able to infer before, the reshoots. Obviously, Ncuti's decision to leave being as a result of the lack of a Disney renewal. All of that makes sense as far as I'm concerned. Then sometime after Season 2 finished airing, Disney informed the BBC that they wouldn't be renewing for Season 3. However, the BBC wanted to hold off any announcement until a plan was in place. Over the following months, there were a lot of discussions about what to do with the show, particularly given how expensive it had become. BBC executives floated the idea of bringing back Tennant full-time following the success of the 60th specials. While RTD didn't hate the idea, Tennant was apparently not interested in returning for a full season or multiple seasons. By this point, RTD was also making the BBC aware that he was considering stepping down following what he viewed as the failure of Seasons 1 and 2. Okay, I'm going to pause there quickly. The fact that the BBC suggested the idea of just bringing back Tennant full-time. Like, look, on one level, I get why they would suggest that. The 60th did well, Tennant's popular. But for the love of God, have we learned nothing? Obviously, fair play, this is a rumour, so, it might not have been said. But if anyone suggested that at the BBC offices, like, come on, guys, have you learned nothing? Like, we need to move on. It's time for... I love David Tennant, and I'm kind of fine with him returning for 2026, on the basis that it is a conclusion to, like, all of Russell's stuff. Fine. But the idea of him returning full-time... that would just be the ultimate admittal that, like, we do not know what to do with this show without David Tennant being on board. We just don't know what to do with it without that. So, yeah, I mean, that's just crazy if that's true. Obviously, again, pinch of salt as always. Further down the line, the BBC also considered potentially allowing Doctor Who to be produced as a film franchise, feeling this might boost the brand's popularity and pave the way for a stronger return to TV. RTD, however, was reportedly firm that Doctor Who should always remain a television series. I think I agree. I wouldn't mind like a one-off movie, but I don't like the idea of the show becoming only movies. Do you know what I'm saying? I also just don't even really know how well Doctor Who movies would even really do. Like, is there enough of a cultural kind of like knowledge of Doctor Who, specifically as well outside of the UK, for movies to make sense? Maybe television movies, like how you'd have like Wallace and Gromit on BBC and stuff, but I don't know whether you'd get like do you know what I mean, feature film releases out of Doctor Who that would really do that well? I don't know, like, especially to justify the budget that they would require. I just don't really know whether the popularity is there. Following these discussions, sometime in September, RTD and Bad Wolf eventually agreed they would part ways with Doctor Who, returning only for a 2026 Christmas special to wrap up the RTD2 era, something that the BBC were happy to accept following the disappointing outcome of the Disney deal. Okay, so this is interesting because this says, obviously, contrasting with a couple of the previous leaks that we've read, that, you know, Bad Wolf would be sticking around. This does say that they're leaving. Obviously, I have heard both things, so, you know, it's obviously it's difficult to really know either way. Russell, I think, is more nailed on. I still think Bad Wolf could kind of go either way from what I've read here. Since then, the main things I've heard about the special are from a variety of sources, so some of this may be hit and miss, that it will include the Daleks and potentially Cybermen, returning Pantheon members, a somewhat continuation of the Timeless Child narrative, act as a spiritual sequel to Doomsday in the same way that the 60th loosely did continued Series 4, and possibly Tennant, potentially in more than one role. These would line up with the rumour I remember people talking about recently, about the idea of it being the 10th and 14th Doctor as a result of Tennant jokingly saying to his wife, Georgia Tennant, about, you know, putting the costume back on. So potentially that could be what they're referring to here. What I will say is, if that's all accurate with regards to the special, like, obviously they've said that that's bits and pieces from multiple sources, so obviously some of that might be right, some of it isn't. But, like, let's just take that at face value. That feels awfully crowded. Like, you're going to do a spiritual sequel to Doomsday with the Daleks and Cybermen, returning Pantheon members that's presumably going to tie into the whole boss thing. And then also, you're going to make it a continuation of the Timeless Child narrative, and you're going to have Tennant in multiple roles. I'm not going to lie, if that is what it turns out to be, that sounds like a mess. I'm not going to lie. Since RTD decided to step down, I've also heard the BBC have settled on continuing Doctor Who as a TV series, though a movie still isn't being ruled out in the long term. That said, the show may be scaled back in terms of budget and spectacle, and could also feature an even smaller episode count. In terms of the showrunner, BBC are hoping to be far more hands-on this time, feeling more protective of the show than ever. Some executives believe the BBC's drama leadership has previously allowed Doctor Who creatives too much freedom, giving them excessive influence over producers and successive showrunners, which has resulted in a very expensive and valuable show that's lost its footing just too many times. Because of this, the BBC began looking outside the usual pool to give the show a genuinely fresh take, similar to what it received in 2005 after all. When the show first came back in 2005, the BBC didn't go back to hire writers who were working on the show 15 years prior. As you've likely heard, one of the top choices, alongside a couple of other names, Jack Thorne. Thorne is best known for Adolescence. It's apparently his Lord of the Flies series that has impressed the BBC and pushed him to the top of their list. Thorne is said to be a huge fan of the show and very interested, with negotiations ongoing. If it is true about Jack Thorne, I would be so happy. I think, like, a completely new person is exactly what we need, and he seems to have the talent to do it. I think he'd be great. You know, I think this would be a great choice. Obviously, I'll probably rule those words in 10 years, but it turns out that his era is not great either. But, you know, you never know. Despite this, it's also been said that RTD is using his influence to prevent this from happening, and is strongly pushing for Pete McTighe to take over as showrunner. McTighe was reportedly hoping to get the job after Chibnall departed, but the Disney deal required a more experienced showrunner, which is why RTD was brought back instead. RTD was aware of this, so he invited McTighe back for season 2, and promised him a role in the spin-off series, while also assuring him he'd be in the conversation for the next showrunner, feeling he'd effectively taken McTighe's turn. However, as mentioned above, the BBC are keen to reassert more control over Doctor Who, and take it in a genuinely fresher direction, which is why they're pushing for Jack Thorne, a major talent who hasn't written for the show before. RTD, though, is reportedly against this. Okay, so, a couple of things there. On one level, I can kind of see why Russell would feel kind of bad about the prospect of maybe having taken the job from Pete McTighe, if that's what happened. Obviously, I remember back before Russell was announced, Pete McTighe was one of the front runners to take over from Chris, even back then. So if that was the case, and Russell came in to kind of steer this new Disney deal instead, I can understand him feeling somewhat bad about that, you know, like, effectively feeling that he'd taken McTighe's turn. There's another part of me though that's like, at the end of the day, I don't think that should be a reason as to why someone is automatically showrunner. And I side with the BBC in this case. And look, it's nothing against Pete McTighe, but I just don't think he would be the fresh vision that we need. And I think Jack Thorne, you know, I don't know what his Doctor Who would be like, but it would at least be different. Do you know what I'm saying? I feel like I already know what a Pete McTighe era of Doctor Who would look like. He also said that anything about actors for the next Doctor cast is BS. Discussions are way off. Obviously, I don't think most of the leaks that I've read out are saying that they've been cast, more so that there are, like, you know, names in the frame. Oh, and Barclay and Salt were originally going to be in season 3, but not sure this will be the case anymore unless RTD incorporates some of his season 3 stuff into the 2026 Xmas special. And then, yeah, that's the one that we read out before, where obviously this was his thing back in August, saying that Disney are 100% out and they're planning a 2026 Christmas special to wrap everything up, which obviously did end up happening, you know, exactly as he said it would. So, obviously, I've gone over a couple of things said in this leak as we've gone through it. I think the most insane parts to me were the idea that the BBC genuinely considered the idea of bringing Tennant in full time. While I get it, you know, it's kind of like, for me, that would kind of be the ultimate, like, admission of defeat. It's, in a sense, it's the show can't work outside of Tennant, which I just don't think is true. People always forget, or seem to forget at least, that Matt Smith was hugely successful as well, and we all just sort of collectively act like, you know, Tennant was the only one. And don't get me wrong, UK-wise, Tennant probably was the biggest of all the modern Doctors, undoubtedly, but I don't think Smith was that far behind. Like, you know, I remember reading articles back in the day talking about how, like, you know, Matt Smith's 11th Doctor launched like an 80% increase in bow tie sales or something like that as a result of that Doctor being as iconic as they were and that look being as iconic as it was. So I think this whole idea that, like, Tennant is the only one that can make it work just really, like, irks me, because I know that's not true. You know, I was a big fan as a kid of the 11th Doctor, of that era, and I know a lot of other people who were. So, like, obviously, you know, 12's era has become a beloved fan favourite, you know. I just don't buy this idea that it's only Tennant that can make it work, and I think it's kind of sad that if that is true, if that is something the BBC suggested, that the BBC seemingly, some people at the BBC at least, seemingly feel that way. I think that's just kind of sad. With regards to other stuff, though, obviously the idea of Jack Thorne, we've discussed at length before, and obviously the idea that RTD is basically saying, you know, he wants McTighe as his successor. Whilst I get the feeling of, if that is true as well, him being like, oh, well, I kind of took his turn last time, I think it's time to go for someone completely outside of the circle. I really, really do. And I really hope in this case the BBC are the ones in the right on this, and that in effect they are the ones to put their foot down and say, no, it's time for someone new. With regards to the 2026 special, obviously they did say themselves that it's a mix of sources saying what the plot would be. If that is the plot, it sounds like it could be a bit of a mess, but then in fairness, it's got a lot to wrap up, you know, in one episode, I suppose, so is that avoidable? I don't know, necessarily. Barclay and Salt were going to be in season 3, which I find interesting. Makes sense, given, you know, obviously War Between did, like, obviously the ending of Reality War led into the War Between, I think, with, like, the whole like, ocean shifting after the reset as well. So it makes sense that they would follow up on that in, like, a, you know, 3rd season, I think. Although, having said that, it would kind of be irregular for Doctor Who to cross over with, like, the adult show. Obviously, Jack was in Doctor Who, obviously outside of Torchwood, but of course, and then again I say that, the Torchwood lot were in Stolen Earth Journey's End, so maybe it's not that weird after all. I know that obviously it didn't work the other way, you wouldn't have the Doctor in, like, Torchwood, although he did appear in Class, so I don't really know what the rules are. Yeah, and then the other thing is basically, you know, Disney having been gone for a while, which, to be honest, again, I think a lot of us kind of put that together after a while as well. The idea of Doctor Who films, again, I think a one-off would be fun. I don't think I'd want the franchise to become, like, you know, a series of films. And again, I also just don't know how big of a demand there is for Doctor Who in like in like cinemas and in films. Obviously, they've released finales in cinemas, and they do well for one-off TV episodes released in cinemas that you can watch for free at home. But I don't know how well like a full Doctor Who movie would do. Especially at this point. I think if there was any point in time you could have done it, it probably would have been around like the 50th time, or around maybe like peak of Tennant. Maybe you could have got away with that. Now, though, I just don't know whether we're in a place where you can get away with that, but who knows? It's an interesting idea, at least. But let me know what you guys think. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you later.